Why monitoring and modeling biodiversity in agricultural landscapes? I want to start with a number that you guys probably all know. Agriculture is really one of the major land uses we have on the earth. About 50% of the habitable land area is used for agriculture, and this has major impacts on biodiversity. And many studies, this is only one of them, including also the global assessment of IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They all show that agricultural activity is one major threat to biodiversity, especially also for the threatened species. And we can see that effect on biodiversity. This is one figure which compares the decline of farmland birds. This is the red curve here, to the decline of other birds, for example, forest birds, and we see even more alarming trends here. So why is that actually the case? Why is agriculture a driver of biodiversity loss? And we here see basically that it's the reason that it changes landscapes a lot and in different aspects. So we see changes in land use, land cover, conversions of grasslands to croplands, and these major types of transformations. But we also see changes in land use intensity, and this is what we in the land system science community group into basically three different things that happen. So it's changes in input to the system, changes in output to the system, and then changes of the system properties. And one specific aspect of the properties are changes in landscape structure, where we, from the landscape ecology perspective, talk about composition, changes in composition. So how is the landscape composed of different land use types, of different habitat types? And then also the configuration, which deals a lot with connecting elements, landscape complexity, or field sizes. And so field sizes, I'm based in Dresden, and this is a region where we saw huge changes in field sizes over the past decades. So this is an example where this is a collaboration with a remote sensing group here, which is really interesting, where they derived remote sensing data from the CIA. It's called Corona program, and it was basically used to survey or to spy on the interesting countries. So Saxony is covered by this interesting data set, which ranges back to the 1960s. So it's super interesting for us to look into changes into the landscape structure. You see really big changes in the field sizes between 65 and this is 2018. But I'm going to come back to this data set later. So agriculture and biodiversity, and this all comes together in ecosystems, is a very interesting relationship. So we have this effect that I talked about before, habitat loss and degradation of habitats due to agricultural activities, fragmentation of landscapes, etc. But then at the same time, many of these threatened species are actually providers of ecosystem services for pollination, for pest control, etc. And we have many studies that show that biodiversity is crucial to maintain for food security and for the resilience of ecosystems. And so basically, if we want to make this work in the long term, we are looking into this trade-off. So this is not a new idea. So it's actually from a paper that we did 7 years ago, but it's looking into the relationship between biodiversity and agricultural production. And among many studies, we typically find something in between this like leaf-shaped relationship. So in most cases, we see a decline of biodiversity and with an increasing agricultural production, and this is why we speak of a trade-off. And now we have different options of how to navigate in this solution space. Ideally, we would follow these best case scenarios where we increase production, but we don't lose so much of the biodiversity. And this is the worst case trajectory, so to say, where we only increase production a bit, but we still lose a lot of biodiversity. So even though we have this concept and several studies have been done in this direction, we still don't know actually how to do this in the best way. And this is what I'm gonna show some of our approaches in the following. Keep in mind, we talk about biodiversity in agricultural landscapes, and many of the species that we actually find here now are the result of the long-term traditional arable and livestock farming in these landscapes. So after this intro, what is this talk gonna be about? It's gonna be a mixture of different projects that we are doing in my group here. What is important? We are working in real landscapes, so we don't have this setting of a experimental campus or experimental farm. So all our projects are in relation with partners from practice, so the Landscape Care Association and also biosphere reserves. So what I want to present today is I want to have a few words on biodiversity data and landscapes, because this is basically the core of this talk. I want to summarize from my perspective what are really the challenges for monitoring and modeling farmland biodiversity. I'm going to pitch a bit of our current work, 3 studies, which I think have could be a nice potential link to the current activities in FINOROP and maybe also future joint work. And I'm going to conclude with an outlook of interesting questions to study. So what is a landscape? And I think landscape is a term that we hear very often, and it's not so really clear in people's minds, and it's also not so clearly defined what it actually is. But it is acknowledged also in the policy, in the key objectives of the Common Agricultural Policy that was started this year. So we have this aspect of environmental care, where the biodiversity goals fall into. But we also have this aspect of landscapes. There is actually a definition of what a landscape is, and we have a European Landscape Convention, which was initiated in 2000. Germany has still not signed or ratified it, though. And this definition is kind of interesting because we have all these studies talking about upscaling to the landscape level, and we want to generalize our results to the landscape level, etc. So by this definition, landscape is an area, and here humans come into play. So first of all, it's what we see, and this perception by people is really a major point here. So this how we see a landscape is part of the whole definition. And then the second part, and this is what we see if you look into German or European landscapes, obviously, that it is the result of the action of humans and then the interaction of natural factors, and that kind of develops of what we can do with these landscapes. Landscapes as study objects are really complex, and this is where landscape ecology is based, which is kind of my disciplinary home, where we combine an ecological functional approach to study what happens. So which ecological patterns and processes can we identify? How can we understand? How can we model them? And then the geographical spatial approach, which looks into the environmental characteristics and heterogeneity. So landscapes are quite complex, and I want to share this with you before I go into the details of studies that we're doing, because it's really not so easy. We have the phenomena that we observe, so occurrences of species, abundance of species, etc., which are based in theory, right? And there are two major theories that are relevant: the island biogeography and the metapopulation theory. And then we are faced with the reality of data availability, geospatial data, other information, which come with a certain sampling scale. And then for understanding or for finding these relationships, we actually have another scale that comes into play, which is called the analysis scale. And this is the scale where we, for example, in my group, develop our models. And so it's really kind of a complex system, and I think this is also part of the story why we don't have such a clear knowledge of what to do where in order to conserve biodiversity in agricultural landscapes at the moment. Second thing I want to briefly mention, biodiversity monitoring. So this is just a reminder for you of what biodiversity actually is. We have the accepted definition on the Earth Summit in 1992, so leading to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it's actually, it's a lot, and it includes the diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. It's a broad term, and I always argue that we should be very specific of what we mean when we're talking about biodiversity, but then sometimes, or often I also just use this term. The biodiversity monitoring community is super active at the moment, and it's really fan of using new technologies. So this is just an example from one paper from last year, where the authors try to give an overview of what are the different monitoring technologies that can be used, from microphones, eDNA, cameras, different versions of cameras, LiDAR, radar. All in combination with AI for the analysis workflows, and then citizen science really plays a major role. So this is just to show you that I think many of the technologies which also play a role for PhenoRob are actually also used a lot in the biodiversity monitoring and in the ecological research community. A major driver of the research that is happening is GeoBon that I'm involved in, which is the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network. A very long word, but this is the driving community for what should actually be observed by defining, first of all, essential biodiversity variables and then essential ecosystem service variables. There's a lot of effort in proposing monitoring systems for biodiversity at the global scale and also at the national scale. So, for example, we have a German National Monitoring Center on Biodiversity. It's established. It's in the filing phase, I would say. So this is really kind of a very active field at the moment. And I'm, as you might already know, I'm really interested in all these new technologies and how we can harness them for biodiversity monitoring. So this is a bit of an advertisement of a special issue that we're doing in biological conservation, which is focused on these new technologies and how we can actually use them to improve agri-environmental schemes, because there we really see a lack that these new technologies are not really made use of. And I'm going to show you some examples later of what we do in this direction. So a lot of people are interested in biodiversity. A lot of people are interested in biodiversity monitoring. And there's a huge data set theoretically available, which is collected by GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which, as you can see the numbers here, as of yesterday, it was more than 2 billion records of species included in this data set. But, and this is something I'm really interested in, is that we have biases in this data set, and agriculture and cropland is really a very understudied ecosystem in this direction. So here are some figures from a publication we are currently doing, where we use this GBIF data in combination with global land cover data and land cover change information to understand how good is actually the coverage of all these biodiversity data for cropland. A lot of figures. I just want to highlight a few points. So what you see if we compare the observations in the cells for cropland cover compared to all the cells we have, and for the cropland cover change, we see there is a clear lack of information. So, for example, 1/3 of the observation is done where the cropland cover change was below 1%. This is what you see here. So we really don't have such a good knowledge of the active or the areas where a lot of change is happening. And this is what you also see on this map. All these yellow areas are those where we have few observations, few biodiversity data, but where actually a lot of cropland cover change has happened. Another point which is interesting is on this figure. We, according to the IUCN classifications, most of the species do not use cropland. But then, around 8,000 species are assumed to inhabit cropland-related ecosystems. From our analysis, we saw that actually 60,000 have records in cropland. So this is a huge data gap where, like with our static knowledge of how species behave and what type of land cover they use, we are probably underestimating the value of croplands and how biodiversity is using it or navigating to it. So a lot of research gaps that need to be explored. But it's not so easy. And since my talk is about monitoring and modeling biodiversity, I want to summarize briefly from my perspective what are really the main challenges. The main problem is all biodiversity models need environmental information. So this is an example from species distribution models, which we also use in my group. And in these models, we always navigate between the geographical space and the environmental space, and then going back and forth. So we always need environmental data to make our predictions. And this is not so easy in agricultural landscapes, because as you know, we have highly dynamic systems, we have spatially and temporally variable management. We often don't have data. So the LPCAX, or in German it's INVICOS data, are an amazing data set, but it's really hard to get access to them, especially for ecological studies. We also lack yield data. So with my working in real landscape research background, this is a major gap. It's really hard to get this information across wider areas, so across a landscape, which we want to tackle. And so basically, we end up that we often don't know. We have species detections, we have biodiversity monitoring data, but we don't know the conditions and the management at the time when the species was observed. And this makes it so hard to actually understand how species use and navigate through agricultural landscapes. Similar for biodiversity data collection, access to the fields, of course, is an issue. It's more complicated to deploy monitoring devices. So this is an example of the audio devices we use. Harder to place them in an agricultural landscapes. You would not want to do that because birds would sit on this pole and obviously you would record them happily singing. So this is just by the sampling design, you can introduce quite a lot of biases in your data set. And then if you remember this figure of landscape research, where we have to take into account these different scales, phenomenon, data, and analysis scale. And so when designing a landscape level study, we actually would like to know what is the agricultural land use and management in the upcoming field season. And typically we're not able to get this. So we basically have to do imperfect study designs and then later account for this in our analysis. And then, as with all ecological projects, it's really the collection of data is based on project-based funding models. So I'm really interested in the concept of result-based agro-environmental payment schemes at the moment, because this is a nice bridge of using monitoring data for biodiversity and actually achieving an outcome. So the whole idea of these payment schemes is that farmers are only paid if they achieve biodiversity outcomes, or certain species in a certain abundance are observed on their land. There are quite a lot of arguments for this. So we assume that it's more flexibility and also more autonomy for the farmers, because they can decide what they want to do with their land. So no specific actions are prescribed. And we also can show that in some cases they have higher cost efficiency, because you may select areas with low yield losses, but high biodiversity potential. And here the challenge really is the monitoring of outcomes and uncertainties. So this is a growing field throughout Europe in different countries. We see some patterns. So it's more something that is used more in grassland and less in arable land. And we also see that there are certain taxa which are targeted more by these schemes. So more plants than animals. And in this context, and I'm now switching to the 3 examples of our current work I would like to show to you. We're currently doing a study where we try to monitor sagittal flora in cropland with UAVs. It's a site which is based in a biosphere reserve, a little bit northeast of Dresden. It's also a Natura 2000 site, and it's an interesting site because these fields are managed by one farmer. And this central part is under extensive management, and the outer parts are under intensive management. The background is that the Biosphere Reserve is planning this as a green connecting corridor, and this management has been like this for several years now. It's a collaboration we're doing with a geosensor systems group at the TU Dresden, who also was flying the drone for us. So the data used are RGB data, multispectral data, and then hopefully we will also get point cloud information. We combine this with a quite intensive field survey of the different floral species with different plot sizes on the training and on the validation plots on both the extensive and intensive fields. Where we identified to the species level, we estimated proportional cover, and we also estimated traits. And as you can see, so this is barley, this brownish box, which really makes up the most of the cover in the intensive fields. It's also, it's of course also the major plant on the extensive fields, but you can see here that there's a huge variety of different floral species. So the workflow, we are in the process of doing this. So currently a lot of work goes into the labeling of the data, which we do at the 10 meter, or the data acquired at the 10 meter flight height. Just for your reference, you see what the data or how the resolution gets coarser and coarser. So we do the labeling on this 10 meter data. We use YOLO for the segmentation, and we're making, of course, then prediction models at the different resolutions, and we use the plant survey on the ground for our validation. We have 22 species in this site, so it's quite diverse, which is an interesting data set. It's also covering different types of species. Some are flowering, some are not flowering. And we are currently struggling, at least in the labeling, with plant height. So what you see here is basically the field measured plant heights, where we see that these purple bars are the species that we are able to label on the acquired images. This is the height of barley at the time of acquisition. And obviously, it's much harder or sometimes impossible to label them on the small species. For now, we have done the model for the cone flower, which is a very prominent and also often or proposed species also for result-based payments in agriculture, which works quite nicely. You see the results here. So this is the correlation between the modeled and the observed flower cover. So really observed in the field, in our field data set. We see it works nicely for this flower. We also see that in the intensive management, actually the flight height does not have such a big impact on the accuracy of the models. Yeah, so this is one example, and I think there's, or I'm hoping for some feedback on that, and also for maybe future interaction. The second technology we're interested in or we're using is passive acoustic monitoring. So basically microphones for us, the interesting part. So I mean, as you know, they are used a lot from infrasound for recording wind, earthquakes, etc., to ultrasound used in medicine, and for kind of recording different what we call phonies. So biophony is the thing we are interested in, and this is a really emerging field in the recent years due to sensor development, due to better technologies, and also to improved analysis algorithms. It really has a lot of huge advantages compared to the traditional biodiversity monitoring in the field. better temporal and spatial coverage. We don't have this observer bias because some people are better in detecting species than others. We can restore the recordings, check them later, and also check for potential errors. And we can also show that's actually better in terms of cost benefit if when we compare to traditional survey methods. So what we are doing, we are using audio morphs that you also saw in the previous picture, which is probably the most commonly used device because it's very cheap. It's around 50 euros. So we can cover large areas with that. The idea is to collect this information to split the spectrogram into different parts. And then there are some really nice and well-working analysis workflows. So for example, BirdNet, which is a ResNet and works really well for European bird species, and which is able to kind of detect species based on this soundscape data. We do this, and we have collected a nice data set last year and also this year in a wider region in Saxony along transects, where we have the audio morph devices and where we also have done traditional bird surveys, so we can actually compare these different monitoring methods. And now we can do a lot of different things with these data sets. I would like to briefly show you. The first one is we are interested in understanding what we call functional responses and habitat selection. The background is that at the landscape scale, sometimes we cannot really prove that agro-environmental schemes or also certain measures have a positive effect on biodiversity. Why is this the case? Because there are differences in species, how they react to conservation measures at the individual and at the population level. So we might not see them at the population level. But then if we look closer and we go more into the transect scale, sometimes we see these effects. Because species tend to change their choice of certain land use or habitat patches in response to varying habitat availability. So basically, in some species, we find that they are not so much more attracted by certain agro-environmental schemes if the availability increases. And this is what you see here with this red figure. So habitat selection in the blue one, it does not change when the cover increases, but in the red one, it really changes. So the more of this measure is available, the less the species is attracted by that. And so, yeah, we're in the process of analyzing these data for different species. So this is an example for the yellowhammer in our case study region, and we really see this effect. This is a novel idea to apply this to agro-environmental schemes, which has not been done yet. Let's see how it works, but it could really be an interesting explanation of why we see these different effects between individual and population. We can also do other things, and I'm now focusing on the landscape structure or more landscape elements, where we see a lot of changes in the landscapes and where we also see trade-offs between species. So some species, for example, like hedgerows a lot. The yellowhammer likes it a lot, as you can see here. So there's a preference for certain hedge densities, but then if we have more hedges, actually it's not beneficial anymore. The skylark is a species which really hates hedgerows, so you see a clear decline of the occurrence rates with increasing hedgerow density. And now I'm coming back to this old corona data from the 1960s. So our idea is to use these observations of current landscape structure and relate them to previous landscape structure, where we see a lot of differences. For example, by comparing them with the current Copernicus woodies, small woody features. And we can see this is an edge detection algorithm where we see that we had many more edges in landscapes in the 1960s compared to what we see now in the landscape. So our idea is to see how, if we can link these current biodiversity models with the previous. There's a lot of things that need to be done in this direction. So standardization of these workflows is something we're currently working on. sound detection spaces, basically for a camera, when you detect a picture, you have the clear footprint of what was measured. It's not so clear with the soundscapes because the sound travels very differently depending on which vegetation type, which land cover you have. So this is a field which is currently very much under development. And then we are really interested in improving in terms of the thresholds we are applying to the AI-based predictions. So we put quite an effort in getting good validated and labeled data sets because this really differs between species. This is a figure which shows a lot of different species. And we see the ornithologist labeling compared to the AI confidence level. And we see that we see this general grouping, which is good, that the false, true false and the true positives are grouped together. But we also see there's a huge variation in the thresholds that should be applied. So our idea is to go beyond this deterministic binary threshold setting, which is the current state of the art in this model, and to go more into a probabilistic way. So this was the work that where we collect our own field data. In other studies, for example, European projects, we're more interested in synthesizing information, biodiversity data and models across different case studies. So for example, here, this is a project where we cover multiple study sites across Europe. And here we use existing data. So the ELPIS YACS data and the INVECOS data are the major source of information, which we combine with different environmental data sets. We use the information on the agro-environmental schemes, and we combine it with bird observations. To study many different things, in brief, what we see in this figure is different species. We see different scales. So spatial scale is something which always needs to be taken into account when we talk about biodiversity modeling. And we see effects of different land use and environment. The sad result of this study is that the current agro-environmental schemes we have are kind of beneficial, but the adoption level, so the proportion that they cover in the landscape, is just too low to see significant improvements in breeding habitat suitability for many prominent birds. We also see changes of effects, so larger effects at the larger scale. This is all these yellow bars here, which is the largest scale we took into account. And we can also use such models then to make conservation-oriented scenarios. So this is based on recommendations of which agro-environmental measures at which cover should be applied to develop specifically explicit maps for our target species. So to conclude, and this is a bit a point of interest and discussion, maybe for future joint work. A lot of the ecological or agroecological thoughts currently go into spatial targeting and optimization. So obviously the idea is to use yield data information. You can see it nicely here. So yield within a field within 1 year, or yield within a field across multiple years. And then the idea is to combine this with what we, from an ecological principle and conservation goals, would like to achieve. So connectivity, amount, the diversity or the heterogeneity of landscapes, and how this can actually be brought together. The interesting thing is that these are concepts. All of these are conceptual papers where they propose that this approach could be good. And I would be super curious in trying out if this can actually be put into practice. Because, and this is my last slide, there are really a lot of unresolved questions in terms of biodiversity and agriculture at the landscape level, because landscapes are so complex, as I showed before, and we can look at them through multiple lenses. So there are huge gaps. We don't know, as I said, how species use agricultural land. We often have this binary view where we say, okay, agriculture, this is the matrix, the species do not use it, all the habitats are in between. we're actually not able, because we don't have this spatial and temporal high resolution information on agricultural management across landscapes. So we don't know what the resistance of these landscapes actually look like. And this really makes it, or this really limits for agricultural landscapes in particular, our abilities to apply all these types of models that generally exist in the ecological modeling community. And final words, there is a quote from 92 actually, and this is really one of my research motivations, which says the struggle to maintain biodiversity is going to be won or lost in agricultural systems. And so I hope to contribute to winning this effort with the research we're doing. And so many thanks to my team and many thanks to you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.